Good evening. Thanks for joining us for session 4 of Apologetics 101. Tonight's topic is the problem of evil and suffering. As we get into our study tonight, I want to start with some definitions. Theologically, evil is anything in opposition to God. Now, the world defines it as something that brings sorrow, distress, or calamity. But it's interesting that the world's definition depends on the perspective of the viewer. And so, apart from objective standards of what is evil and what is not, what one person considers evil, another could consider righteous by the world's standards. So that's why we use a theological definition tonight, that evil is anything in opposition to God. Now, there are two categories of evil. There's natural evil and moral evil. Natural evil consists of things like natural disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, etc. Moral evil there's two categories of that. There is ethical morality, or ethical evil, or lack of ethics, however you want to put that, which basically are the offenses we commit against other people. And then there's cultic evil, which are offenses that we commit against God. Now, it's interesting to me also that there's some overlap here in that from God's perspective, moral evil against other people, or ethical evil against other people, is also cultic evil against God. And then finally, suffering, our definition for that is just the experiencing pain and mental distress. Just kind of generically, and I think most people agree on the definition of suffering. So now that we have some definitions, why is evil and suffering a problem? Well, evil is pointed to by some that deny God's existence, and it's pointed to by others that deny God's love for them personally. And you'll hear things like, well, how could a loving God allow this to happen? Or why didn't God heal my spouse, my child, or my friend? Thus, evil is manifested as either an emotional issue or an intellectual issue. Now, most of the times, the response to evil is an emotional one, and people are feeling pain, they're feeling anger, they are looking for comfort. They're not looking for words of wisdom or an intellectual argument to make them feel better. Words don't make you feel better when you've hit your thumb with a hammer. Okay, what you're looking for is relief and comfort. Now, on the flip side of the emotional issue it's an intellectual response. And there are two categories of intellectual responses. One is a logical version, which says the existence of God is illogical, or it's an evidential version, which says the existence of God is improbable. They're very similar, but most atheist philosophers have put the logical question to bed because they know they cannot win that one. The evidential version, that the existence of God is improbable, is a better argument, but it is still highly defensible. So let's take a look a little deeper here. First, at an emotional response to suffering. Most of the time, as we said, people are just hurting or they're angry. Emotions are not products of rational thought. Thus, rational argument is not going to be of much benefit. So the most important thing we could do may not be what we say, but what we are. We be a good friend. We be supportive of the other person. However, we do try to discern along the way whether or not the person is suffering with God or apart from God. This knowledge is going to help us to understand how to pray for this person and how to better respond to them in the future. And so, are you ever at a loss for words when seeking to comfort someone who's suffering? Have you learned what to say? Well, we're going to talk about that in a little bit here, but it's really, for me, it's always been an awkward time. It's been an uncomfortable time because I didn't know what to do. I wanted to say something to make the person feel better, and really that was a completely wrong approach. I can't say anything to take away the pain, but I can be of some support to them and help minister to needs. And so with the compassion of Christ in us, what we try to do is share as God leads, but we share from the heart to appeal to the heart. And sometimes in their pain or anger, people say things that sounds like an intellectual argument, but it's hard to tell. And you'll hear things like, why didn't God answer my prayer? Where was God in all of this? If there really is a God, why is there so much evil in the world? And so we tread very carefully here. We may know the answers to some of these questions, or we may know how to answer them, but people expressing the emotion of pain and suffering, again, are not looking for rational answers. And so, but we want to be very careful because these questions stem from a poor understanding of the gospel and God's role in our relationship with Him. Remember, God is God. We are the servants. We serve Him. He does not serve us. And so some people believe that it's God's job to serve them. And when He doesn't, well, then He must not exist. And even with the proper perspective of our roles between, who's God and who's the servant, suffering and loss is real and is painful. Knowing that God walks with us during those times makes them bearable and also enables us to shine through the darkness with that peace that surpasses all earthly understanding. And so I want to give you a list of things here, of things that what not to say, and some suggestions of what you can say to someone who's suffering. And actually, it's kind of like David Letterman's top 10 list. And so I'm going to give you the top 10 things not to say, or the worst things to say to someone in grief. And number 10 is be strong. Come on, you weakling. Grow up. Be strong. Number 9, she did what she came here to do, and it was her time to go. Or number 8, I know how you feel. Number 7, she was such a good person, God wanted her to be with Him. Number 6, you can still have another child. Number 5, aren't you over him yet? He's been dead for a while now. Number 4, there is a reason for everything. Number 3, she brought this on herself. Number 2, he's in a better place. And number 1, at least she lived a long life. Many people die young. Those are the worst things to say. Now the top 10 lists, best things to say to someone in grief. Number 10, say nothing. Just be with the person. Number 9, you could say, I'm usually up early or late if you need anything. Number 8, we all need help in times like this. I'm here for you. Number 7, give a hug instead of saying anything. Number 6, I'm always just a phone call away. Number 5, my favorite memory of your loved one is. Number 4, You and your loved one will be in my thoughts and prayers. Number 3, I don't know how you feel, but I'm here to help in any way I can. Number 2, I wish I had the right words. Just know that I care. And number 1, I'm sorry for your loss. So I hope those will be helpful to you in the future. I'm guilty of saying many of the things you're not supposed to say. And so I'm going to try to be more careful. But here's some guidelines, okay? Don't try to lend your wisdom to someone to help them to get through their time of suffering. And certainly don't be judgmental. Be supportive. Say the things that will indicate that you can do things for them, that you care for them, okay? But and let it go at that. I've heard people say that in their time of loss, it was the things that people did for them, picked up some groceries or took care of an errand for them or something. Things when they just had all on the things they could handle on their plate. Somebody helping out with that meant more than anything else. So keep those things in mind. Now, when we shift gears now to talk about intellectual suffering, I want to talk about the burden of proof for a minute. A couple of weeks ago, when we talked about the existence of God, the burden of proof was on us as Christians to demonstrate God's existence. And we had several arguments that we presented to illustrate that. Now, when others can't claim that suffering disproves God, the burden of proof now is on them. They have made the claim, not us. And so we must force them to hold on to that and not try to shift that burden of proof to us, which they will try to do. Most likely, they will say something like that, well, why do you believe that suffering demonstrates God? If you haven't said that, don't claim it. Don't own it. Leave the burden of proof on them, and then when they present their arguments, we can examine them and rebut them. Now, moving on to the intellectual response, the logical response to pain and suffering. In this approach, atheists are attempting to show that belief in the existence of God is illogical. And this is because they believe these two statements are mutually exclusive. And all in loving, powerful God exists and suffering exists. They believe that they're mutually exclusive because of two other unstated premises. The first being, if God is all powerful, he can create any world he wants. And the second being, if God is all loving, he prefers a world without suffering. Therefore, God wants and can create a world without suffering, but since evil exists, God cannot. So part one of this response. If God is all powerful, he can create any world he wants. Can God create any world he wants? On the surface, it sounds like it. But God cannot create that which is illogical. He can't create a square circle. He can't create a married bachelor. Okay? And so God wants a world whereby people choose to love him. And by having the choice of loving him or rejecting him, we are bound to have evil in the world because people by moral free will choose evil over God in some cases. And therefore, it is impossible to create a free world people without evil. It is illogical. So does God, in the second part of this, if God is all loving, he prefers a world without suffering. So does God prefer a world without suffering? Well, suffering is sometimes allowed for the greater good. For example, when we take our kids to the dentist, from the child's perspective, we may appear to be terrorists. But from the parent's perspective, we know this is a good and right thing for the child, good for their health. Or suffering is sometimes a result of free will abuse by others. And yet free will is still the greater good, because this is one of the greatest gifts that we have from God, the right to choose him, the right to be able to serve him by our own choice to follow him. Unfortunately, there's also the right to reject him. God gives us that right as well. Suffering is sometimes a result of natural processes, yet a greater good is found in these. For example, plate tectonics, that create volcanoes and earthquakes, play a vital role in regulating the temperature on the planet and recycling nutrients, sustaining life on the planet. Unfortunately, people are sometimes in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yet the greater good is served, because without them, we would all be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so if there really is a God, why is there so much suffering in the world? Two reasons, I think. One, because we live in a free will world. And two, because people choose to follow the evil desires of their hearts rather than the heart of God. As we continue on with the intellectual response, we're going to look at the evidential version. It is improbable that God could have a good reason for suffering. Can there be no good reason for suffering? Part one, good reason, is suffering looks unjustified. Is it really unjustified? I mean, who can see the big picture? Who can see the future? We are limited in space and time and knowledge, but God is not. And so we can't see everything, he can. Now, for example, from chaos theory, it said that a butterfly flapping its wings in Africa could set in motion a chain of events that could result in an Atlantic hurricane. Well, that's fine and good, but how could you predict that from any single butterfly? What would happen? You cannot. So every event sends ripples throughout history, such that God's reason for allowing it may not be understood by us for centuries later. God's goal is to dwell forever with those that choose to love him, in a place free from evil, pain, and suffering. He calls all of mankind to himself, not to place an impossible yoke upon them, but to set them free from the desires of this world to a life of hope, meaning, and purpose. So part two of this response, that it is improbable that God could have a good reason for suffering. Part two focuses on probability, or improbability, however you want to look at it. Probabilities are always relative to some background information, to some set of facts. For example, this is a false set of facts, but this is an example. 90% of college students drink beer. Joe is a college student. Therefore, there is a 90% probability that Joe drinks beer. So that's how probabilities work. And so probabilities are relative to the facts. And so what is the background information regarding God's existence? Well, the background information is the full scope of evidence. And so Doubts raised by suffering are outweighed by the full scope of evidence for God's existence. For example, the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument that we covered in session 2 are evidences for the existence of God, and these outweigh the question of suffering. Now, other arguments exist for you to add to your arsenal, the most popular of which may be the moral argument. Now, we didn't cover that in the existence of God, so I'm going to lay it out very briefly here. But first, I'm going to ask you a question. Is evil relative? By what standard do we determine whether something is evil? Well, the moral argument says, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. But evil does exist. Therefore, objective moral values exist. Therefore, God exists. That's the short version of the moral argument. So if God does not exist, then suffering may be painful, but it's not necessarily bad in a moral sense. Apart from objective moral standards, what is evil for one person could be righteous for another. Consider the Nazi extermination camps of World War II. One side, it was righteous. To another side, it was pure, unadulterated evil. And I think God holds that same perspective. Now, as we continue with our intellectual response to suffering, think about what are the alternatives that God could have pursued in creation? Well, he could have created a world with no free will, whereby people could only choose to do evil. That wouldn't be a fun place. Or he could have created a world with no free will, where people could only choose to be good. And yet that seems to underplay his objective of creating a world where people would freely choose to love him. He could create a world with no people, and again, he has no people that would choose to love him. And the fourth alternative is creating a free will world. At last, a world where free will could be exercised to demonstrate love or hatred for God. Now, someday free will change. In heaven, the presence of God and his love will be so powerful that those who love him in this life will never, ever turn away. Those that don't will demonstrate their heart even with his overwhelming presence, as evidenced by the revolt at the end of the millennial kingdom of Jesus. Now, someday we're gonna be in God's presence, and this millennial kingdom of Jesus, as I understand it, is going to include those that are not fully converted as we have been. There are going to be people that live through the tribulation, for example. The whole world will not be wiped out, but the millennial kingdom will be established, and God's overwhelming presence will be there among all people for 1,000 years. And at the end of 1,000 years, there will be a revolt to demonstrate that it's the heart of man, regardless of the environment, that condemns him. Now, before we close tonight, I want to share with you some biblical truths for Christians. These are things we know, but as Christians, it's good to have some reminders. Some things about suffering, some biblical truths for suffering. We suffer because we live in a fallen world. God didn't create a fallen world, but Adam caused the fall when he rebelled against God. And all of creation groans because of the fall. We suffer because of our own foolishness. We reap what we sow. We suffer sometimes because of God's discipline. We may suffer because of our faith. The chief purpose of suffering is the formation of Christ-like character. Our suffering proves and tests us. Suffering is a process. Suffering is a purifier. Suffering provides opportunity for our testimony of Christ in us. Suffering glorifies God to the angelic world. Suffering manifests the power of God to others, and suffering manifests the character of Christ in us. And as we know, Jesus suffered and grieved. Now, God desires a people who would choose to love him. We can't choose to love him unless we can choose to reject him. Because some choose rejection, evil will exist for now, but God is at work to call all people to himself, and many come to him through suffering. At the appointed time, he will eliminate evil and suffering from our presence for all time. And I'm looking forward to that. And so that concludes our session for tonight. Our homework question, something for you to think about for next time, is how has suffering changed you? Has suffering had an impact upon your life? Has it led you closer to God? Has it pushed you away? We'd love to hear from you. Again, if you have any questions concerning our topic tonight or anything else we've discussed, please feel free to email them to questions@brentwoodbible.com, and we will do our best to get back to you with a response. Thanks for joining us, and I hope to see you next time.